Anyway, introduce Robert Greasy. He's professor emeritus in the School of Environmental and Sustainability at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and the former director of the University's Mathai Botanical Gardens in Nicholas Arboretum. He's formerly taught in the landscape architecture program and is a strong advocate for ecologically based design and ecological restoration. He has researched the work of the early landscape architects who advocated such an approach to design, especially the works of O.C. Simonds, who's done a lot of work locally, and Jensen, who worked throughout the Midwest, including here in the Rock River Valley. Bob is the author of Jensen, the maker of natural parks and gardens, and the Native Landscape Reader. He is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architecture, as well as the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. He is also honorary member of the Garden Clubs of America and serves as the president of the Ann Arbor chapter of the Wild Ones. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Jerry. I hope we're not going to have too much of an echo. We were trying to work this out, and if it gets irritating, we'll turn off the mic, I guess. But
we're getting some
feedback.
Come up closer. Are you on?
It seemed to be better maybe standing further away from it, but I don't know. Is that too irritating? Or
back up some part of
is that better?
It's better. I don't hear any feedback right now.
What do you think?
We'll go ahead and start.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. And I'll just try to go slower so that it's not too bad if that's.
Well, what we're getting is a delay between your speaking and the speakers.
Okay.
The feedback could be because of the recording, but there's nothing we can do about that.
Yeah, just turn the lavalier off.
Okay, if I talk, is this okay?
Are you able to hear him now, Janet?
Yes, I am.
With that, I can stand over here to be closer to the microphone. So anyway, thank you for having me here. As Jerry mentioned, I'm president of our chapter of the Wild Ones in Ann Arbor, and actually was the founding organizer of the chapter back in the 1990s when we got started. So I've been involved with the Wild Ones a long time, and I'm delighted to come speak to you tonight. As Jerry mentioned, I'm going to talk about the work of various practitioners, designers here in the Midwest who advocated for native plants, and try to connect that to what I see today as issues in sustainability, as ideas of native gardens. And with that, I'll try advancing the slides to get started. So first of all, I'll give an overview of some of these pioneers in landscape design using native plants. I'll particularly look at the work of Jensen and O.C. Simonds, and then I'll give some thoughts about lessons learned from their work that I think can be applied today in terms of native gardens. I should give you a little bit of background of how I got started studying these individuals. I did my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, just up the road from you here. And I was fishing around for a topic for my master's thesis. And one of my professors suggested I study the work of Jensen and his work at Lincoln Memorial Garden in Springfield, which at that time was about 50 years old. And the idea was to find out how that landscape had matured and how to manage it going forward. So in doing that, I discovered that there was this whole body of people in the late 1800s and early 20th century that were advocating for native plants and gardens. And then certainly O.C. Simonds was a contemporary of Jensen. And then when I moved to Ann Arbor and joined the faculty at the University of Michigan, lo and behold, I discovered that O.C. Simonds was the founder of the landscape architecture program there, and had also designed the arboretum that I would come to direct at over time there. So I've had a lot of involvement with these folks, and anyway, I'll share a bit about them. So this is just a collection of some of the people that I discovered were all interacting. Many of them knew each other and were advocating for the use of native plants. Frank Waugh was a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Wilhelm Miller, I don't know if any of you are aware, there was a publication in 1915, 1916 called the Prairie Style, excuse me, a Prairie Style and Landscape Gardening that Wilhelm Miller wrote as part of, he was the first extension landscape architect for the University of Illinois. And so he was a clear salesman of the work of Jensen and O.C. Simonds. Elsa Raymond and Edith Roberts were women who wrote a book called American Plants for American Gardens in the late 1920s. Genevieve Gillette had worked, excuse me, had worked in Jensen's office and moved to Michigan, where she was an advocate for state parks. Alfred Caldwell had also worked in Jensen's office and did a lot of design work, particularly in the Chicago area. And then May Watts was a fellow Danish American to Jensen, and wrote a book called Reading the Landscape of America. She was a education specialist at the Morton Arboretum. And that's one of the books that encouraged me to become a landscape architect. So I had to include her on this list. So I like to think we remember their work because they were all advocates of regionally based design approach that dovetailed with a lot of conservation efforts at their time. And their work continues to inspire a lot of designers in terms of native gardens. And particularly they were advocates of native plants. They weren't necessarily purists in terms of only using native plants, but native plants made up a large percentage of their projects. And that was somewhat unique at their time in terms of advocating these gardens. So within that work, Jensen and Simonds' work was known as the Prairie Style. Walter Burley Griffin, who was an architect in the Chicago area, and he also was known as a landscape architect, was included by Wilhelm Miller in this publication called This Prairie Spirit in Landscape Gardening, which came out in 1915. And it was interesting in that publication that it was promoted as free to anyone in Illinois who promised to plant native plants in their yard sometime in that next year. And that recently was republished by the Landscape of American Landscape History. So you can still purchase a copy of that if you want to see what he wrote about at that time. He particularly used the work of Jensen and O.C. Simonds as examples in that publication. And Simonds wrote a book called Landscape Gardening in 1921. Jensen wrote a book called Siftings in 1939 that was published by the help of the National Council of State Garden Clubs. So all of those publications are good brief references about their work. They were, both Jensen and Simonds were very much inspired by the landscapes of Northern Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan. And particularly they were enamored by not only the plants of the region, but the way spaces were organized, qualities of light, and the fact that they could celebrate this heritage as opposed to borrowing plants from other regions. At the time, many gardeners were enamored with planting rhododendron and complaining that they couldn't grow them very well in the Midwestern region. And so both Simonds and Jensen thought that using the plants of the region was a good way of celebrating our own natural heritage. Here's a quotation from Jensen written in 1920, where he talked about his impressions of the prairie, describing it much like a forest cathedral, and talked about the qualities of light that he saw in the prairie and the changes that he saw over the course of the seasons. I'll start with a little bit of biography and examples of work of Jensen, and then turn to O.C. Simonds. So Jensen immigrated to the United States from Denmark in 1884. He had a couple of jobs in different places across the United States, but eventually ended up as a street sweeper for the Chicago West Parks in 1886. By 1888, he had moved up the ranks, where he created a design for what he called the American Garden in Union Park. And the theme for this garden was that he felt that many people were moving to the city from the regions around Chicago and would miss the flora that they saw, the wildflowers that they saw in the countryside around Chicago. And so he would bring these together as a landscape in the park. And it became a very popular part of the West Parks in Chicago. Jensen went on to become superintendent of Humboldt Park, and then later became landscape architect for the whole West Park in Chicago. Several years ago, I had a chance to visit Denmark, the region that Jensen was from, and partly because it's in an area of Denmark known as Schleswig-Holstein that had been taken over by the Germans. It now serves as a national military park. And so going there, you can still see the plants that Jensen studied in the fence rows through the park. And they included wild roses, hawthorn, and various wetland plants. And what I found particularly interesting was the changing qualities of light and weather constantly there. I was there during the month of September, and it seemed like every day we would have these 20-minute thunderstorms that would flare up off the North Sea, and then they'd be followed by a rainbow across the sky. And that kind of interaction of landscape, sky, and weather were things that impressed him much about the landscape, and I think became something that he celebrated in his landscape designs. Here's the example of the American Garden on the left-hand side of the screen here. And this was really, to my knowledge, one of the first experiments in terms of trying to create a garden exclusively of native plants. On the right shows what were some of the typical scenes in the West Parks at the time. Other designers felt that the parks were boring because they were basically flat, and so tried to create little artificial hills with waterfalls, or a lot of garden statuary as part of the parks. And so this idea of a more naturalistic palette of native plants was really quite unique at the time. And as I mentioned, this became very popular. So some of the other influences in Jensen's career, he had become very good friends with Dr. Henry Coles, who was a botanist at the University of Chicago and one of the pioneers in talking about ecology as a science for looking at how landscapes grow and change. As he came to Chicago, his family would frequently take the rail cars out to the edges of Chicago metropolitan area and collect plants. They would just wander around, study the landscape. He wrote that oftentimes the streetcar conductors were worried about letting them back on the train because they were carrying baskets of plants they had collected. But it was through those excursions that he really got to know the landscape around Chicago. In 1899, he was appointed to the Special Parks Commission that was responsible for the original forest preserves of Cook County. And I know you have forest preserves here in Rockford and Winnebago County that followed from that original set of preserves. And then in 1900, he was abruptly fired for not participating in some of the graft that was going on in the Chicago parks at that particular time. But by 1905, he was rehired, became the general landscape architect for all of the West Park region. He was involved in remaking many of the parks, like Humboldt Park. One of the innovations he made there is what he called the Prairie River, which was a open lagoon that used native prairie plants along the shorelines and meant to attract a series of native waterfowl to the parks in the heart of the west side of Chicago, which was by that time had become a very large industrial district. And they were concerned at the time of whether or not many of the native birds would really be able to survive in the park. But it became very successful. He used it on the slide on the right here that shows sculpture exhibits associated with these native plant gardens in the park. There also was great attention to rethinking playgrounds and schoolyards around the west side of Chicago. He was concerned that children were only given basically gymnastic equipment in these parks and gardens. And increasingly, the parks became more naturalistic under his care, with the idea of children having wilder habitat spaces to play rather than gymnastic equipment. And the hope was for them to use their imagination and be able to interact with wildlife and plants. This park on the left side here, called the Lloyd School Center, was his idea about remaking our schoolyards to be a much more child-friendly place with swimming pools that appeared to be like natural quarries. There was a vegetable garden as part of the school that he saw as being an intergenerational place where seniors in the community would come and teach gardening approaches to the school children at the school. And the schoolyard, the playground itself, was a series of outdoor spaces. They were separate for boys and girls at that time, but they really didn't have any play equipment. It was more a series of outdoor spaces for children to use their imagination and play. Then one of the last parks that he created on the west side of Chicago was Columbus Park, which was this particular park was on previously undeveloped land. The one feature he had to include was a large golf course at the center of it. So it was a mowed course, but at the edges, he included native prairie plants. Again, there was a prairie river, and the source of water for the river came from a series of artificial springs, showed with the rockwork here that was typical in a lot of his work. And again, he was very interested in having habitat here for a variety of native waterfowl and birds. And he was delighted when the great blue heron took up residence in these lagoons. And as you can see, they were actively used for boating by recreation. One of the other features of this park was what he called a player's green. As a child in Denmark, he grew up in a series of what were called the folk schools, that a lot of teaching was done out of doors, and there were a lot of celebrations of the solstice and the equinoxes. And he felt that in the United States, we didn't have a culture that was really in tune with nature. And so he saw one of the solutions was creating a series of outdoor performance spaces to hold large gatherings. And at Columbus Park was one of these places as an outdoor theater. And the idea was that there'd be a stage area shown as what's called the player's green. The audience would come and sit on the lawn facing west, where they'd watch the sunset. And then as dusk was coming, if there was a full moon, that would be enough light to light the performance. If not, they would set bonfires on either side of the stage. And the whole idea was to really get people outdoors and enjoy theatrical productions or musical events set in an outdoor setting. And the picture here is a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream that took place in the park here at Columbus Park. While he was doing these public gardens for the Park District, he began doing private design work, particularly during the period when he'd been laid off from the parks from about 1900 to 1905. And the private gardens he was designing allowed him a chance to experiment with ideas that were not as conducive to public park work. And many of these gardens were really almost like small working farms where there would be places for growing food as well as for restoring more of a native habitat on these places. And most of all, he was very interested in creating places that would reconnect people with their natural heritage. Many of his clients were wealthy businessmen and women, and he wanted to have places that would provide a sense of respite when they would come home in the evenings to their place. This particular quote, he was often very critical of gardens that simply borrowed plants from other parts of the world and were not really suited to our habitat here in the Midwest. So instead of importing plants from China, Japan, and Europe, he thought we should be using really our Native American plants as well. And those are some pictures of plants that he favored. One of these landscapes was the Harry Rubens estate in Glencoe, Illinois. On the left upper photograph is one of the wetlands. This is probably one of the earliest wetland restorations that I'm aware of anybody really doing, using native prairie and various other wetland plants as part of that landscape. On the bottom right is a plan shown for that particular wetland. And then he did still include lawns as these landscapes, but in his mind, they symbolize as broader prairie space. And oftentimes native prairie plants would be used around the edges of these lawns. Here's some examples of some of the other properties. The Becker Estate in Highland Park on the left, upper left. At the bottom left is the Harley Clark Estate in Evanston, Illinois, which is the estate is now being converted into a center of publishing. On the upper right is a bird garden near the University of Chicago. And on the bottom right is a design done with Frank Lloyd Wright up in Marquette, Michigan for Abby Roberts Longyear. Perhaps its largest private projects were done for the Ford family in Michigan. Initially, the initial one was for the Henry and Clara Ford estate, known as Fair Lane in Dearborn, Michigan. Henry had a couple of requirements. He wanted a hydroelectric dam, and so Jensen designed that to appear to be a natural waterfall on the Rouge River. And you can see some of the stonework here on the bottom left that it looks like it was natural outcropping in the river and remains so today. On the right is a view from the terrace of the Fair Lane, which is set on axis with the summer solstice. Again, this quality of light that he wanted to exhibit. So on sunset on the summer solstice, the sun sets at the very end of the meadow space there, flooding that entire space with light. There also are some white birch trees planted at the very end of the meadow, so that in the early morning, those trees catch the morning sunlight. And there's a letter that Jensen wrote to Henry Ford later in his life, and he talked about walking this landscape with Henry and Clara Ford and enjoying the sunset, and how Henry had remarked that sunsets were one of the great spectacles of nature, but that few people took time to enjoy it. And Jensen clearly felt that was one way of connecting people to nature, to experience things like sunrise and sunsets. At the time Jensen did the work for Henry and Clara, Fairlane was part of about 26,000 acres that the Ford family owned in Southeast Michigan. And his plans were developed over between 1913 to 1921. Here's an image of Clara and Henry and one of Clara's brothers sitting at the end of the meadow. And on the bottom right are pictures that show looking down the meadow, a view of the meadow on the solstice, and then a picture of some of the white birches at the end that captured the early morning light. Here's a picture of the stonework of the dam under construction using limestone set in horizontal pattern as if it had been laid by the glaciers as opposed to being constructed. And there you can see the estate as it appeared from the Ruth River. He also did work for Edsel and Eleanor Ford. He designed about 4 different properties for Edsel and Eleanor. There's an aerial view of it on the upper left. Much like at Fairlane, there's a meadow space that was set on axis with the summer solstice. Again, this is set on Lake St. Clair. On the bottom left is what was known as Haven Hill, a retreat for Edsel and Eleanor Ford in Highland, Michigan. And that's the cabin there that Jensen worked around. On the right are some images of the swimming pool and lagoon at the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house that I've recently had a chance to work with the estate to restore that lagoon and the plantings around it. It really is a very, very beautiful native wildflower garden. You can see a small waterfall. Originally the pool water just emptied directly into Lake St. Clair, the heated water. That's simply been changed, but it's this wonderful connection. When you're swimming there, you feel like you're part of the Great Lakes right next door because you can see from the lakes to the broader lake beyond. And I'm very happy to see that they restored that as a feature. One of Jensen's last major public projects was Lincoln Memorial Garden down in Springfield, which was a project both of the Springfield Garden Club and the Garden Clubs of Illinois. It was meant as a living memorial to Abraham Lincoln that would be done with native plants. And the Harriet Knudsen is shown here on the left. She was the president of the Springfield Garden Club and the woman who invited Jensen to do a design for the garden. On the upper right shows some of the initial plantings. There are almost no trees on the property, which bordered Lake Springfield. And on the bottom, you see Jensen's plan, which were a series of walkways and lanes, all featuring plants from the states where Abraham Lincoln had grown up. And because many of the plants weren't available in the nursery trades at the time, school children from across the state of Illinois and Indiana were invited to collect acorns. And in 1936, this group of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts marched across the site to plant those acorn trees. Also, Garden Club members across the state of Illinois rescued plants from sites that were being destroyed across Illinois and would ship them by rail to Springfield, where they were planted as the conditions were appropriate for them. So some of the plantings were done immediately, and then as shade developed, more woodland plants would go in to help shape this particular garden. So it really was a visionary project that took over 50 years to evolve as the trees matured and they could have multi-layers of vegetation. And then these are some pictures from the last couple of decades showing what that landscape looks like today. This grove here is the grove of oak trees planted by those school children back, or the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts back in the 1930s. And finally, Jensen, I was talking earlier about the school that Jensen created called The Clearing in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin. He wanted a school that would teach arts and crafts and avoid what he called overstuffed learning that he thought schools were guilty of. And so on the upper right are several pictures of Jensen at that landscape and as it appeared while he was still living. On the bottom are an assortment of pictures showing the views out over Green Bay, the schoolhouse. This is a class that I taught there. I teach them periodically, and we usually do some landscape management project, either reopening views, planting some part of the property, rejuvenating something there. And this is a view from one of the council rings that he created, a place to sit on the edge of the lake. And it's quite a beautiful place. If you ever have time during the summer to go spend a week and retreat or take a class there, it's a wonderful place to be immersed in his heritage. Then switching over to O.C. Simonds. Simonds was born in 1855 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His family owned a farm, and he grew up, much like Jensen, studying the plants and the fence rows along his family's farm. He studied civil and environmental engineering at the University of Michigan, graduating in 1878. And his first job after graduation was to survey the lands that had been cut over in Michigan to provide trees to rebuild Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire. And after graduation, and then he went to work for William LeBaron Jenney in Chicago, and soon discovered his first project was a revitalization of Graceland Cemetery. And he found that he really enjoyed landscape architecture or landscape gardening, as he described it, much more than architecture. And so he basically switched careers and eventually founded his own company designing landscapes throughout the Chicago region and really across the Midwest. He became superintendent of Graceland and then really established his larger practice. Like Jensen, he did a lot of residential designs across the country. By the time he retired, or by the time he died in 1931, his work had taken to all 48 states at that time. This is just an example of several of his projects. A project on the upper right for Julia Larned in Hubbard Woods, Illinois. And much like the work of Jensen, you can't really see it too well there, but there are lines extending out from the building, which are views to the sunset, much like Jensen, and he would plant plants like goldenrod and other things that would highlight the setting sun behind them. On the left and bottom right is a version of what really was much like a condominium project, where 4 lots, 4 houses would share property in common so that they would have longer views. And he planted the slopes with masses of native trees and shrubs, creating a setting for these particular houses, which at the time were at the edge of a golf course, if I understand it. One of his properties here along the Rock River was celebrated in an article that was published. It was for the Howell family in Dixon, Illinois. This was touted as a low maintenance landscape. There was almost no lawn other than mowed pathways through the landscape. It was a mixture both of native plants as well as cultivated plants. I think some of these are peonies, for instance, down in here. But he also restored a small wetland on the property. And the idea was to have a fairly low maintenance landscape that featured primarily native plants. At his own property in Chicago on Montrose Avenue, one of the themes in Simonds' work was that he was almost more interested in views from the house than to the house from the road. And so frequently his landscape designs, he would plant up the edges of the property with shrubs, and you only got glimpses of the house. This was from a publication on the bottom left there, where in what's sometimes called the lawn extension or the right-of-way, he would plant densely with shrubs to provide a sense of privacy and sense of enclosure for the house. Simonds designed park systems throughout the Midwest, the upper Midwest, some along the Rock River, various communities around Rockford. One of the most extensive ones was for Quincy, Illinois, where there are about 5 or 6 parks that were linked throughout the city through a series of parks and boulevards. And these are just some early images from those particular parks. He designed the park system for Ann Arbor, Michigan, and which included Nichols Arboretum that I served as director, the park system for Madison, Wisconsin, and really worked much more extensively than Jensen across these small Midwestern towns. Here's just an image of his design for the Arboretum at the University of Michigan, and some of the articles touting when he came to visit to survey the lands for the Arboretum. With that in mind, I'd like to switch gears and talk about some of the themes in their work. First of all was that they spent a lot of time observing patterns that they saw in the wild and then adapting those patterns as a basis for design. They really tried to connect their gardens to an area's natural heritage. They incorporated scientific analysis and thought in their designs using what they learned from foresters, what they learned from conservationists, what they learned from plant ecologists in their work. And they often incorporated the natural change and succession as part of their designs. And then oftentimes their designs were used as bridges to local conservation efforts to inspire people to protect wilder versions of those landscapes. So in terms of studying the native landscape, they looked at outdoor spaces as a series of outdoor rooms where there'd be masses of trees and shrubs that would create spaces that felt enclosed and places where people felt comfortable. They also noted that much like the architects in the prairie style that were using horizontally branched or horizontal patterns in their work, they used small trees like hawthorns and crabapples that brought that sense of horizontality to their landscape. The image on the bottom left there is from Simonds' book, Landscape Gardening, where he talked about a sense of mystery in his landscape. Rather than things always being geometrical or on center, to plant things slightly off center that encourage you to sort of walk through the landscape and discover what was just beyond the bend in that landscape. They looked at patterns of plant arrangement as you might observe in nature. So on the upper left here is Jensen's border planting for Columbus Park, where he planted trees really close together. A lot of foresters were advocating for trees maybe 20 feet apart, 40 feet apart. Jensen planted them 2 or 3 feet apart in whole groupings. And there was this strong contrast when you left the grid of the city and suddenly you were in this park where everything was planted in very irregular patterns and shapes. On the right-hand side there are a couple of diagrams from Simonds' book, Landscape Gardening, where he noted that humans tend to plant things in rows and sort of equidistant patterns. And he urged people to study fence rows as a way of learning how nature distributes plants and then model that in your landscape designs as well. So the upper diagram there is mapping where the centers of trees and shrubs are. And the bottom is how he said that humans tend to plant in contrast. On the bottom left is a swimming pool that Jensen did at Edsel Ford's original property in Detroit using red cedar and other plants in a very irregular planting. Looks like it just happened in nature. And that is probably one of the things that was challenging in maintaining their landscapes long-term, is that they looked too natural, that most people didn't always appreciate that they were physically designed. In terms of outdoor rooms, one one of the terms Jensen often used was a sun opening, that you had a place where it's surrounded by fairly dense trees and shrubs, and you allowed a space for the sunlight to come in the middle. And usually there are pathways around the edge of that opening, knowing that people felt more comfortable walking in shade and looking into a sunny meadow type space. And so he would deliberately design his landscapes for that. On the upper right is an illustration from O.C. Simonds' book, where he talked about looking at the landscape during the winter when snow's on the ground, so you could get this contrast between the open space in the center and the masses of trees and shrubs around the border of that space. While they did plant some plants that were typically cultivated in the period, like lilacs and spirea and things like that, there was a great emphasis on plants that served as habitat for wildlife. So this, for instance, was a plan by Jensen for a bird garden and near the University of Chicago in the city. And this is an image of women in that garden that was published in the 1920s. On the bottom right is an image of a bird pool created in one of Jensen landscapes with, it was an in-the-ground pool with shallow areas for wading birds to come in and get a drink of water or to wade in the water. On the upper right is a photograph by Jensen. Jensen was always taking pictures of his landscapes. Unfortunately, we have a lot of those to look at. And typically there would be pictures of individual plants, but then there would be a picture where he would step back and look at the habitat where that plant grew. And I like to think that those were what he was thinking about then when he actually used those plants in a landscape design. I already talked a bit about these players' greens. These were spaces for outdoor learning and celebrations. This was a players' green at Fairlane at the Henry Ford Estate. The audience was to set here, and then the audience would set in the foreground, and the actors would act in the background there. On the bottom left is one of his private estates where he created one of these performance spaces. And then again on the left, on the right, is his plan for Lloyd School Center, showing the different settings there. I talked a bit about the qualities of light. And so there was often, Jensen in particular noted he was on the board of directors for the Chicago Art Institute. And he talked about, he particularly enjoyed the paintings of George Ennis, where they often showed a sunlit opening in the woods. And these were features then that he used. So on the bottom right there is what Jensen labeled as a sun opening at the Lincoln Memorial Garden. And on the bottom left is a scene in the parks that Simonds designed in Quincy, where as you drive along the roads, you're constantly moving from shadowy areas to sunlight and back again. And that creates almost feels like a theatrical way of moving through the landscape and experiencing it that way. On the middle bottom is a view of the lodge at the clearing in Wisconsin that's set to capture the summer sunset. And on the upper right is a pathway to the winter sunrise that allows sunlight to enter the windows of the lodge building at the clearing in Wisconsin. And then there was a sense of celebration and restoring a landscape. So I already talked about Lincoln Memorial Garden, but this was clearly a long-term vision of not just thinking about how immediate landscape, but thinking about something that would continue to evolve. So planting acorns, planting seedling trees and shrubs, and clearly managing it over time to evolve. There's a whole slew of correspondence between Jens Jensen and Harriet Knudsen of the Springfield Garden Club, where she would write him and seek advice on how to manage this, if something was happening there. And it's clear that he had these ideas sort of long-term of how this garden would take shape over a number of years. And I think that's part of his genius in terms of helping shape these landscapes. Then finally is this link to conservation activities. Jensen had become involved with a group in Chicago known as the Playground Association that was interested in taking school children and people living in tenement houses in the city of Chicago out to the wilds around Chicago. And so they would organize what they called Saturday evening or Saturday morning walking trips, where they would take people out to bird watch, to learn to see wild areas around Chicago. Eventually that became known as the Prairie Club, and became a force that helped to protect lands in the Indiana Dunes and state parks around Illinois. Later then, about 1915, 16, he organized more of a political action committee that he called the Friends of Our Native Landscape that was meant to help protect areas around, particularly initially around the state of Illinois. In 1928, they wrote this pamphlet up here on the right called Proposed Park Areas for the State of Illinois. And what they would do would be to travel to the areas where they were promoting a state park, have a big celebration. They would invite local people to be part of that, and then argue for protecting that area. So some of the state parks not far from here, around Oregon, along the Rock River, were places where they came out, typically on the summer solstice, and held these events as a way of building up support and then going back to the state legislature to set aside these areas as state parks. He also organized a chapter in Wisconsin, and there was for a time a chapter in Michigan that also were influential in setting aside the state parks in those particular states. So, so what of these principles are useful to today? So today, I think that one of the key thoughts is idea of sustainability, reducing energy use, water use, and fertilizers. Again, much like Jensen and Simonds' day, connecting people ecologically to their natural heritage, and then opportunities to preserve local heritage and beauty by acquainting people with their native flora, introducing them to local wildlife, teaching them to care about such things. The challenges that we face today are somewhat similar. Sometimes public perceptions that don't really appreciate these wilder looking landscapes as being intentional. General lack of knowledge about plants or how to grow native plants. Weed ordinances that get in the way for many people in terms of planting these landscapes. Sometimes the changed site conditions where soils have been dramatically changed through farming, through industrial use or whatever. And then oftentimes a lack of understanding how to use native plants in garden contexts. And I know I'm still learning there. So here are some examples of landscapes. Mostly pictures are from around Ann Arbor, but what you can't see on the top is a heading that says Making Native Landscapes Acceptable. And one of my colleagues at the University of Michigan, Joan Nassar, came up with this idea that providing cues that a landscape is cared for. And those can include having boundaries or edges, paying attention to edges to make people, whether it be fencing, whether it be a deliberate pathway through the landscape, whether it be what Joan, my colleague Joan, has called a frame, using boulders or low walls or something like that to enclose the wilder looking landscape, often help people accept it. So defined edges and paths. Advertising its habitat value. These are in my own yard. I actually have a sign here for the wild ones advertising the landscape, but also from the National Wildlife Federation. This is a little plaque for Doug Callany's book on creating a hometown national park that lets people know as they walk by. And my wife can attest that people stop by and look at these things and they copy down the website address. And I think that many people go back and look at those information as a way of knowing that my landscape is intentional and not something just forgotten. Sometimes providing a greater abundance of native wildflowers or forbs can help people find it more acceptable. And then certainly providing for seasonal interest so that it changes over the course of time can help continue interest amongst people. These are some of the older neighborhoods around Ann Arbor where people have created wildlife landscapes in the city. And there's a lot of interest, certainly these days, in pollinator habitat or creating butterfly or bee habitat. In fact, in my neighborhood, I had a neighbor that went around and enrolled, I think she got 70 people to sign on at preserving bee habitat in the neighborhood and to agree that they wouldn't use pesticides and herbicides in their yards. And people have these little markers that they put out. It almost becomes like if you don't belong to this group that's preserving habitat, you're a problem. And restoring biodiversity. These are just examples of some of Doug Tallamy's books that I'm sure many of you are familiar about in terms of encouraging the use of plants that provide habitat for insects, which have provided habitat and food sources for birds. Examples of some of the plants that he sees as being particularly important. And this is now listed on the National Wildlife Federation's website, which I think provides really helpful ammunition for defending plant choices with the general public or with public officials. Just examples of some of the kinds of plants that either they provide fruits or provide habitat for insects with native plants. Gardens that provide a real fit and sense of place. These are images from a garden that was developed at University of Michigan campus as a butterfly garden. It was outside of our Museum of Natural History, which for years I had argued that we really needed something that in the landscape that expressed this idea of natural history that was inside the museum. And so some of our landscape architecture students created designs for this garden, and several local volunteers really made it happen. But for many people, it was a real special place on campus. And unfortunately, they tore this up in remodeling the nearby buildings, but they rescued many of the plants and have planted them back at the new biological sciences building on campus, which I don't have pictures of, but I will for the next time I give one of these talks. And then other gardens that also some of my former students helped with the landscape design here for the Chicago Center for Green Technology, which is a former brownfield site in the center of Chicago where native plants were used to filter stormwater as well as to help clean up the soils on this particular site. And done in a way meant to teach people about how to use native plants in their urban landscapes. Back in Ann Arbor, our public library system has adopted a series of rain gardens across the landscape and helping people understand the role of native plants in filtering urban runoff before it enters our local streams. And in my own role as director of Mathai Botanic Gardens in Nichols Arboretum, we several years ago began treating all of the stormwater off our parking lots through a series of bioswales and rain gardens. And when we initially planted these, I don't remember why exactly, but we used a lot of lanceolate coreopsis that blooms bright yellow in the spring. And I went out one day, and here was a couple having their engagement pictures taken where they were crouching down in this bioswale in midst of all these lanceolate coreopsis plants in bloom. And I thought, if that makes us suddenly that these people are accepting this wild landscape, that it was really wonderful to see that happen. And then finally, looking at living roofs or green roofs. I've worked with a number of students over the years. On the bottom right is when I was allowed to take students up on the roof of Chicago City Hall. And on the left is a former student who teaches at Kansas State University, showing some green roofs that he's developed on campus there. And then lastly, just showing some pictures of my own yard. On the right, on the left is a plan. I have a little prairie in the front, a vegetable garden, a bit more woodland close to the house, and then a small backyard woodland garden towards the back. My garage here in front is a green roof on it, picture here. I use it as a place to experiment with plants that will grow in 4 to 6 inches of artificial soil. And it's been great fun being able to work with that over the years. I do burn my yard periodically, get permits from the city. And initially, when the fire marshal insisted that I inform my neighbors of doing these burns, I decided that I would invite them to come celebrate this. And for many years, it was like the end of winter, signal of the end of winter, that we would burn Bob's yard. And it would be the signal that we all get together in the neighborhood, start talking to each other again after being inside all winter. Anyway, it doesn't stay burned for very long. And then one of the key things that I helped to create at Mathi Botanic Gardens was what we call our Great Lakes Gardens. This is an idea that was promoted back. One of the authors I mentioned earlier on were these two women, Elsa Raymond and Edith Roberts, who talked about botanic gardens really showcasing the flora of the region as a real learning center. And so I thought that our botanic gardens should showcase the flora of the Great Lakes region. And so what we've done over the years then is show various limestone habitats, dune habitats, prairie and woodland areas. These gardens have now been in the ground 10 years, and it's been great fun. They've also been places for collaboration. So about a year and a half ago, we had an exhibit by the local pottery or ceramics club that did a series of totems that were on display, where they featured native wildlife and plants in ceramics. And that was a great project to use this particular garden as a setting for that sculptural work. And then lastly, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is connecting with new generations. And so several years ago at Nichols Arboretum, we created an area where we encourage children just to create small structures, whether they be fairies, whether they be small animals, and create small houses for them. And it's been great fun to see children fully engaged. But the rule here is they have to use natural materials. And so they collect twigs and leaves and pine cones and rocks. And it becomes like this little naturalistic village. And then a few weeks later, they come back and remodel it again. And I did have this one parent who told me that she brought her daughter here, and then they went on a walk through the rest of the Arboretum. And she said her daughter was looking behind every tree and shrub, thinking she would find some creature there. And when they left, she told her mother that it was truly an enchanted forest. And I thought that was wonderful to inspire a child to have that sense of wonder. And it's just creating a simple place like this for children to do that. So with that, I'll close. You can't read the full quote here, but a quote from O.C. Simonds, it says, by teaching people to see the common things, you will add to their joy in living. And then from Jensen, landscaping equals the composition of life that unfolds a mysterious mystery from time to time unto the mature age. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions that anybody has. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, do we have any questions in the chat, Janet?
Nothing as yet.
Okay, any questions in the room?
So the original parks that
Okay, the question is, are any of the parks on the West Chicago still in existence as they were created by Jensen?
Yeah, so some of them have seen some drastic changes, but others are still in existence. And there's been a lot of effort with the Chicago Park District to restore some of them. And some of the parks, I have to admit that some of the restorations have not lasted long, that they've been either trampled or vandalized in some way, so they haven't lasted long, but others have done really well. One of the best ones I would say is Humboldt Park, where there's been a lot of effort to restore native vegetation around the lagoons there. And they have, the neighborhoods have changed dramatically. Humboldt Park originally was mostly Swedish immigrants that had settled there. Now it's largely Latinos, and they have really embraced the park. The park commissary, whatever they call it now, has a small restaurant that serves Latino-oriented food, and the lagoon serves. They created, when they restored the vegetation around it, they created small pockets for fishermen to use the pond, and they have like pits where they bury or stock with worms, and so the park district, I think, has done some creative things in terms of trying to engage the populations that live around them, and that has really helped. One of the best preserved parks is actually, ironically, an indoor park, the Garfield Park Conservatory, which it's just beautiful in terms of this Wilder Fern Room that Jensen created, and that's, if you're ever in the winter and want to go visit that, it's a great escape from the bleak winter weather to go inside and have this wilder landscape indoors. Anyway, those they're in various stages, but those are some places that are pretty good shape.
Other questions in the room?
Are there any current landscape architects of note that are following these theories?
So the question was, are there any current landscape architects who are following in the footsteps of Jensen and Simonds?
Yeah, there definitely are a number that are using principles from their work. Some that have attributed their inspiration to Jensen or Simonds. He just recently died a few years ago, but in Sweden, the major firm out of Washington, D.C., he credited his what he called the American Garden design style from Jensen. There's a lot just in various locales of people who are espousing native plants as landscape architects and incorporating them into their work. And increasingly, it's for sustainability reasons too that they need to deal with drought-resistant gardens or reduce stormwater runoff, and they're finding that native plants are really the key to be able to do that. But there are certainly a lot of places around the country that are adopting this, probably not as wholesale within their work, but at least part of their projects really adopting.
Okay, I think we will end the program today, or at this point, and